This week's episode, I'm talking to Dr. Kerith Duncanson. Now, Kerith is a foodie, a scientist, and a dietitian. So she's the best person to talk to today in regard to our topic of food additives. Are they good, bad, indifferent? But Kerith, I think what makes you especially well qualified is the fact not just that you've had a PhD and that you've got 20 years of private practice experience as well as your public health, as well as doing research now in gut health. I think all of those things, like uniquely, mean we are the lucky listeners today. So welcome.
Oh, thanks, Claire. It's very nice to be here. Really glad to talk about this topic and to be talking to you about it today.
So can we just jump in, and food additives is such a big area, really. Why do we
Mhm.
even have food additives? Why do they have to
Yeah,
exist at
well,
all?
I mean, it seemed like a simple question when you sent it, Claire, and then, thinking back through history, through the ages of time of why we have additives, I guess, originally they were to preserve food so that it lasted longer. And then the food industry found other ways to use them to enhance food in some way. So originally preservation and I guess salt, sugar, and things that take the liquid out of food, like dehydrate it somewhat, were the original ones that kept food going before we had refrigeration, before we had packaging, before we had any of that. And then it's kind of gradually morphed into, something that looks a little bit um, different in the food, might be added to increase profitability, right?
Yeah, it's quite interesting, isn't it? So when you think about those original food preservation, because historically lots of foods were only available certain times of the year, or maybe you're going to catch a heap of fish, and how can you make that last forever? Oh, you can dry it out, or you can smoke it, or you can stick it in salty water. So that was really all people had available. And I got to tell you, Kerry, my first part-time job when I was a teenager, I worked in a department store in Brisbane, and I really loved it when I got to be in like the crockery and cutlery section. But one of the things that was really popular way back then in the 70s was bottling. And it
Mhm.
was
Oh
a
yeah,
brand called
the
Cola,
cola,
and I can still
the
remember that people
cola.
would come in to buy more of the rubber rings that had perished, and so I got to learn about,
Eh,
all of this community out there who used to buy
Yep,
cases of peaches or whatever and then bottle them up in their own special syrup and
yeah.
boil them away
Well,
to sterilize them.
yeah, and that was my family, Claire. My family are bakers and caterers, but my grandmother had a dryer, like dried fruits.
Wow.
We had a Vicola. My mum still got a Vicola. We've still got
Right.
a preserving thing. And then living in Bega, my mum was the show secretary, so she used to get given, you
Wow.
know, um, baskets and baskets of fruits and vegetables after the show, and she'd be making sauces, preserves. Yeah, so
Yeah.
food additives, I guess, and preserving fruit is it's interesting to think about historically, and then
Historically,
how
isn't it?
it's
But
been.
it's moved a
Yeah.
lot, hasn't it?
Hmm.
Back in the good old dark ages, probably anybody young's gone, oh God, they're so old. But,
Yeah, that's right.
so it's taken away from, you don't need to
Hmm.
do that. It saves heaps of time. But what are those different categories of additives? I know I was looking on the Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, the regulatory
Hmm.
body for food additives, and going, wow, that's a long list. And I think that list is going to be really handy for listeners, so I'll put it in the show notes. But what are those sort of broad categories that manufacturers are allowed to put in to
Yeah. So,
foods?
yeah, definitely the preservatives that we've talked about. Then there's the colouring type of agents, and then the flavouring agents, and the colours really are completely unnecessary from a nutritional point of view, but are really for presentability and consistency in what something looks like from a consumer's point of view. But the flavour enhancers, to some extent, have been used for people who don't have like a protein content to a meal, for example. So maybe MSG is used to enhance the flavour and give that sort of umami flavour if you can't get that from other sources. And we think of MSG as something that you don't want to have when you go to a Chinese restaurant because it gives you a headache, but it does serve a purpose in a lot of cultures to enhance flavour, particularly where you don't have proteins, and strongly flavoured umami savoury flavours to bring out the taste, I suppose. So they're the three main ones, and then you've got your emulsifiers, which again, you don't necessarily need them. We can all shake a bottle of oil to mix together the oil and water fractions of it, but does one look nicer if it's at the shop, if it's been emulsified, versus something that's separated, and do people see that as going off?
Yeah, and I think the aisle where you sort of notice that the most is in like the mayonnaise dressings type aisles,
Mhm,
because
mhm.
there definitely are some where the oil layer is separated, but mostly they're not. So
Mhm.
that's where I guess you're going to find the emulsifiers. It's now appealing to our eyes and shelf stability that it can actually
Yeah.
sit there for years and years and actually be okay. And I know it's all variable, but looking at the time for the use by date is a good idea. Can I just suggest, I think there might be one other reason why they use some of those colorings. I've noticed that my grandchildren, if it's a really bright color, they're like automatically attracted to it. And I wonder if there is some sort of, like deep biological drive for that, that if we see something that's a bright color and it stood out in the environment, well, maybe we're going to be more likely to find the food. The fact that it just seems to be so universal that they go, whoa, I'm going for the bright red one or the bright blue one.
Hmm. I agree. And I think, apricots and tomatoes are a great example of that, because I do remember picking them off trees or vines, and, the flavour from those really highly coloured ones being the richest flavour. So we also, naturally, we instinctually went for those brighter coloured foods. However, we don't see many bright blue things
Yeah.
in nature.
Kerith, I wonder if people, if you really want to know about, like what food additives you're eating, I really
Mm.
like the way on that Fazan's website, the broad categories, they actually fit on one page if you want to print them off. Or if you download it, you can take a screenshot of it and then head off to the supermarket and see if you can find what categories of preservatives, or actually you could just do that from the products in your cupboard. They're the ones you've already bought, haven't they? So what I wanted to know then is, there's these broad categories, firming agents, stabilizers, things that didn't exist. Um, are they bad for us? Are they good for us? Does it not matter how many of those we're exposed to? Or yeah, what's your opinion about them?
Gee, that's a tough question. And I mean, if you think about it globally, some of these things are important, particularly preservatives, because we don't want food waste. So at that kind of
Hmm,
global level, these things are important. We probably
true.
don't want crumpets that last 2 weeks. That's a bit scary before they go moldy, or bread, but it does preserve food for longer. So in our global climate of food sustainability, that's on the positive side. At an individual level, it's much trickier because we all have our susceptibilities, particularly some children might be more susceptible to these, even if they're natural food chemicals that are in foods, colours, flavouring agents, and there may be longer term consequences from having them. But it's tricky to measure that, right? Like, do we do human studies? You've mentioned FSANZ. We have a national regulatory organisation, and I think Australia was one of the first countries to have something like that. But it's very hard to monitor the whole food supply to determine safety. And as you would know better than anybody, there's a difference between a hazard and it being a risky food. So foods might not be hazardous necessarily, but they could be risky or vice versa to be consuming. And that could be that individuals have different susceptibilities to these agents that are in foods. Some of them might be riskier at a national or population level, but most of the studies are done on mice, and often they give the mice something that's equivalent to a human being having, say, 800 cans of soft drink in a day. So it really needs to be physiologically relevant in order for us to determine the risk of these additives. But epidemiological studies over time, that might be too long. Our food supply is changing so quickly.
Yeah,
It's
true.
hard to keep up with what
Yeah.
might be risky.
So you're saying, we have the range of permitted food additives, we have sort of safe target amounts, but there's
Hmm. Hmm.
still maybe individuals who are susceptible to those. So in your area of gut health, do you see people where there definitely are things in food, additives in food, that is definitely not, doesn't agree with them or could contribute to their bowel health or their bowel condition?
Yeah. So I would say that it's not necessarily related to the symptoms that they might be experiencing day to day. There could be some food triggers for those symptoms, but it's unlikely that um, that would be specifically additives. The caveat for that would be more those natural food chemicals that some people are susceptible to. And, so we're talking salicylates, amines, glutamates there, which are natural food chemicals rather than additives. And some people do experience gastrointestinal symptoms from those. So the part of their body that reacts to that, for some people it's their skin, and for some people it might be their gut. But I guess when we're thinking about gut conditions and additives, the most research is probably in the space of more the inflammatory type of conditions. So things like inflammatory bowel disease, say Crohn's disease, and ulcerative colitis. So there's been a fair bit of work in that space about emulsifiers in particular. And then much less research, but important research into some of the pre-processing agents that might also be indicated in gut health, I suppose you would say.
Okay, so can I just summarize and then I want to come back to that point about pre-processing agents. So basically, you've said people are kind of in two categories. The people with those inflammatory bowel conditions where there is some evidence for emulsifiers, but then you were talking about people who don't necessarily have a diagnosed bowel condition, but they can still be sensitive to naturally occurring chemicals in foods, the amines, the glutamates, and the salicylates. So it sounds to me like if people think they're reacting to foods and their gut, whether or not they've got a bowel condition, they're probably
Hmm.
feeling pretty confused and trying to figure out like what to do. So
Hmm.
how do you get help, whether you've got the inflammatory bowel conditions, Crohn's and colitis, or you just think you're sensitive to food chemicals? Can you just refer yourself to a dietitian, or do people just experiment on themselves? What would your advice be?
Mm. Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of information out there that's hard to navigate. So I mean, of course, I'm biased towards dietetics, being a dietitian myself, but our clients say that it really helps to have somebody to navigate that with them, and for their own symptom profiles and their triggers. And that could be somebody who's trying to maintain their gut health to prevent any long-term conditions, because they're aware, as we all are, of the importance of the gut microbiome. There's a lot in the media about things like leaky gut and the intestinal barrier that we have to maintain the barrier between the gut and the other body systems. So critically important. And certainly some of these food additives have been indicated in breaking down what we call the mucus layer or the intestinal lining that forms that barrier between our gut and our blood or immune systems.
So that's leaky gut when
That's
that
leaky gut.
intestinal barrier
Hmm.
and it breaks down for whatever reason, and
Hmm.
then you actually have a leaky gut. Well, why? So that's good to know because I think that's a word that gets bandied around.
Hmm.
So why is that a problem to have a leaky gut?
I
I
guess
mean, it
the
sounds like a problem. So
yeah, it's a problem. It's a problem, Claire, for
yeah,
sure. Yeah, yeah, and I will reiterate that some of these food additives have been implicated in that, more so in animal studies, but some of the non-nutritive sweeteners that are in our food supply, and some of the emulsifiers that are in our food supply have been indicated. And so the problem is that the protein component of foods or can be seen as foreign when that interacts with our bloodstream or lymph and our immune system. So if we've got a leaky gut or haven't got that barrier, intestinal barrier, the antigens from food, the proteins in food, our body sees them as foreign and reacts. And that's like, I guess, described as an inflammatory type of response or an immune response. So the mast cells and eosinophils, our immune cells, react and say, that's foreign, and I'm going to react whenever I get exposed to that. So we haven't got that barrier between our gut
yeah.
and the rest of our body systems.
Yeah, so that's a big problem then if you have a leaky gut. So
Hmm.
I think people probably don't realize that having a leaky gut's kind of like having your gastrointestinal tract as a garden hose full of holes. But what escapes across there is that protein, and then you
Hmm.
make that
Hmm.
ant antibody to it, and then all of those problems that you described. But um, Kerith, is there a test for leaky gut? Because it sounds to me that that's probably like a whole lot of symptoms that are a bit vague. And you know how when people have vague symptoms, you're often made to feel like it's all in your head.
Hmm.
So, how do people begin to sort of identify if they go, yeah, well, I think there's a whole bunch of foods that don't agree with me, and I don't think my gut health is optimal? How do you begin
Hmm.
to navigate if you have a leaky gut? Or
Hmm.
when would you have to go and go, right, okay, that sounded like me. I'm going to see my GP. Like what would people do or expect to do to fix a leaky gut or find out they've got a leaky gut?
Hmm. Yeah. Yes, so I mean, it's very hard to, there's not a specific test for that. It would be like a symptom profile, blood markers like the C reactive protein and things like that, and their symptoms. So, be that some sort of arthritic condition or any of these sort of autoimmune type of conditions where the immune system's implicated. But interestingly, Claire, regardless of what might cause that, or if we think it's potentially an issue, um, the solution for most people is very similar. And usually that relates to our dietary fibre. So, an interesting study recently that relates to this that was published in one of the big journals, Nature, was looking at the difference in people's recovery from antibiotic treatment. And I think the three options were probiotic supplements, a fecal transplant, and a high fibre diet. And you guess which one performed the best, Claire?
I'm really hoping it was the high fiber diet and not the fecal transplant. You're going to have to explain to people what that is. And
No,
I think
you're
you should
right.
explain, am I right?
You're right. So
Oh,
to
yes.
protect that gut barrier,
Yeah.
the high fiber, whole food, high fiber, diverse diet outperformed probiotics and a fecal transplant in recovering the diversity of gut bacteria after antibiotics. And so I
Well,
think that's a
yay.
great indicator. Yay.
Yay
Yay
for
team.
high fiber, but just in case someone's gone fecal transplant, I'm thinking that's probably not pleasant, but I think you better explain actually what a fecal transplant is for
Mhm.
uh,
Yeah.
the people who haven't heard of it?
Yeah. And, I guess a lot more people have heard of it now. And in Australia, I just hazard to say that there's only one place in Australia that if you are getting a fecal transplant, that's actually, they've got super donors. So the people who are donating fecal or poo um, for recovery of the gut microbiome, and this has originally been in, specific medical conditions, but is becoming more normalised. So SAMRI, the South Australian Medical Research Institute, is the only real place in Australia where they've really rigorously assessed the poo and the people donating the poo to provide what we call super donor samples, so that we know that there's no risks associated with that from the genetic profiles of the individuals donating the sample. So definitely not something to, um,
Can
do
I
from
just
home.
can I just ask a really basic question?
Yeah.
See, it's an interesting process, and I appreciate that there probably are some people who really do need
Hmm.
that process. But so basically, they get a donated poo stool
Yeah.
sample from
Hmm.
someone. They process it in some way, presumably, to make sure they're not getting some weird viruses or whatever, and do all the, you said, the rigorous testing to make sure there's
Hmm.
no untoward things in it. And then they take that and they put it into the colon of the
Hmm.
person receiving the transplant, the fecal transplant, in order
Correct.
to do what?
To recover the gut microbiome, in order to improve that intestinal barrier that we've spoken about, but also so that the new bacteria, that recovered profile, produce metabolites, produce byproducts that are helpful rather than harmful to the individual, based on their health conditions or their risk profile. So
Right.
coming
So,
back to the intestinal barrier, it's aiming to do a similar thing, because the healthy bacteria create this healthy mucus layer that forms that intestinal barrier.
so what we can say is that for whatever reason, those bugs, I think they're often called the commensal or the usual
Hmm.
population of
Hmm.
species that live in your colon. That's
Hmm.
probably news to some people that, your colon's not sterile. There's lots of bugs that do really good work on silently on our behalf. For whatever reason, their gut is never going to recover. So they need to get the bugs back in there, and these super donors are that's a pretty big thing to do then, to be the donor to help these people recover, fix their leaky gut. But you said,
But we
Kerith,
also know, yeah.
yeah, you said that they tested probiotics, which is the
Hmm.
bugs, they tested the fiber, and then they tested that procedure. And so, do you think the probiotics, and maybe if you could tell us what that is, and why do you think the fiber was actually better than even probiotics?
Well, the fiber was better than probiotics because it's feeding the beneficial bacteria. If you're taking probiotics, you're getting a limited range of bacteria. They may be helpful, but if you haven't got a high fiber diet alongside of that, they're not being fed, so they're not going to last that long. Whereas if you have prebiotic or helpful, life giving fibers from the diet, they're feeding all of the beneficial bacteria. And, even compared to the fecal transplant, by feeding that beneficial bacteria, you're changing the profile in a helpful
Right.
way,
Yeah.
yeah, over
So that's
time.
probably good for people to know that, because you go to the even the supermarket these days or the giant chemists, and there's just hundreds of types of
Hmm.
probiotic supplements, but you're right, they're usually only a few species. But down there in the colon, there's a massive range, isn't there? So
Hmm.
that so just taking the bugs that have got to travel all of that way, it won't give you the diversification that you needed. Whereas when you have the diverse fibers, you're actually feeding the ones and allowing them to increase their presence, the ones that would
Yeah.
break down those
And we're
fibers in
talking
your colon.
Well, we're talking the whole way through your intestinal tract from your mouth right through, because we know that there's bacteria all the way through, and we want that profile to be beneficial all the way. And so, currently having this real push towards higher protein type of diets, potentially at the expense of fibres, has a huge influence on that. Not related to food additives, but interesting nonetheless in our current food climate.
Yeah. So I think we've given people some hope for keeping their colonic wall healthy so
Hmm.
they
Hmm.
don't get a leaky gut. We've kind of said if you've got a leaky gut or think you have, it's likely that you'll need to get medical help for that and hopefully dietetic help. Ask to be referred to a dietitian who specializes in gut health. But can we
Hmm.
just come back to those additives now? Because the one that's come up twice is
Hmm.
actually the emulsifiers. And
Hmm.
emulsifiers, I always kind of think of them as like washing up liquid, really
Mm.
good at breaking down fats and helping like clean up a mess. So are there emulsifiers and any other additives? Are there any other adverse health effects apart from these ones in your colon, in your gut?
Yeah, well, just to firstly summarize the ones in your gut, some of those emulsifiers, CMC or carboxymethyl cellulose, if you want to say the big long word, polysorbate 80, which is not really widely available in Australia but is highly studied and available overseas. They do, uh, in animal models, at least promote overgrowth of certain types of bacteria compared to others, and potentially contribute to this translocation of bacteria via that leaky gut we've talked about, reduce this mucus layer. And I guess if you want to put this really simplistically almost, are they doing some sort of emulsification in the lining of our gut
Oh
as
dear.
as well? We don't really know. We don't really know. But there's something that they're doing, that that is potentially unhelpful in the gut. And it's interesting because, um, you know there's natural emulsifiers, lecithin and pectin and guar gum and things like that. These are in our food supply. I'm not saying by any means that they're unhelpful or unhealthy to have as part of a balanced diet, but um, the extra ones that we're adding, I don't know whether they work differently or what is happening, but there's certainly some suggestion that they're unhelpful at that gut level. And then we're also, thinking that there might be some uh, extra intestinal responses to having food additives as well. So, for example, the food colorings and some of those are linked to behavioural issues for children, um, and um, there's not strong evidence around carcinogenic effects of food additives. Some people, are in the general public are concerned about that, but they could be the ones where there's that, very high dose in animal models. It's really hard to know what the actual effect is. So, for example, studies that they've done on aspartame, a sweetener, so it was originally identified that when you put two amino acids together, synthetically, that creates an intensely sweet flavour. These are amino acids that are in our food supply naturally, but when you join them together, they create this sweetness. But the tests that have been done on that to determine the safety profile, uh, as I said, it's like having 800 cans of soft drink a
Mm,
day. So
yeah,
it is really hard to know what that actual effect is.
yeah. So, Kerith, I was going to ask you, but I think you've kind of already answered this,
Hmm.
whether some particular categories are worse than others in terms of like effects on your gut. But it seems to me that the ones that occur naturally, like you said, lecithin and a couple of the others that are actually in foods, all the
Mhm,
foods you mentioned were also high in fiber. So I'm kind of thinking their effect comes almost
mhm, mhm,
packaged with the ingredients, so to speak, for keeping that intestinal barrier and keeping your colon and that mucus layer you talked about
mhm,
really healthy, as opposed to if you've potentially got a leaky gut and then you're having the full on additive without the protective fibers, that the same chemical in different
mhm,
forms is what is worse,
mm.
perhaps. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think this is the same discussion around the ultra processed foods, isn't it? Like, as in, they're usually that combination of things like additives, highly refined grains, and low fiber. So, again, it comes back to, well, regardless of exactly what that risk is, the solution or the way to avoid that is know our own bodies, know our own risk profiles, build up this beneficial protective layer in our gut by eating a diverse high fiber diet and going back towards the whole food. So it's sort of like regardless of what the risk or the cause is, the solution is going to be the same.
Yeah, and that brings up that really important point. You know, if people are following the discussion on ultra processed food, well,
Hmm.
the most processed is category four, with the
Hmm.
definition that it's usually additives that you wouldn't find in grandma's kitchen, basically. So,
Exactly.
as being ultra processed. So, let me ask you personally then,
Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
do you specifically try to avoid these highly processed foods?
It's interesting, Claire, to think of it. I kind of flip it back and think the other way. I'm really lucky to have that background of bakers and caterers in my family. So having those skills to be able to put together meals from scratch. So it's not necessarily that I actively think I'm going to avoid food additives, but I feel fortunate and grateful that I've got that skill set to be able to prepare foods from scratch. So I don't need to be having the highly processed foods to get good flavour in it. And I do actively avoid plastics and packaging. So again, with that ultra processed foods, the reasoning behind that is to do with the plastics and now microplastics, which is
Yeah,
not technically a food additive, but it's
a
being added to our
contaminant, I
food.
think you'd say.
It's a
And we
contaminant.
actually, we actually have had a whole podcast on microplastics
Yeah,
before.
yeah,
But I think you
yeah.
made a really good point, that um, you're fortunate to have had that background, family background
Hmm.
particularly in bakery. Gee, that must have smelled really nice. So with that background, then
Hmm.
there must be some favorite foods that you have.
There are favourite foods that they have. When that question came through, I thought, one of the things that I love is the Japanese culture around food, and that's not only those fresh, natural flavors of the food and the predominance of seafood, which I love, but also the attention that goes into it, the social side of eating, the cultural factors in that. So I love I love all different cultures of food, to be honest. And what I particularly love is to go. We have great markets here in Newcastle where we both live, to go and look what looks good and what can I make from that, or what do I feel like making. So I guess I love looking at produce and thinking that would go with this kind of culture or the recipe that I want to make, and be able to do that, and be able to do that for my family and be able to enjoy it. And that doesn't mean spending a lot of money. Sometimes it means spending a bit of time. Like, my Sundays are
Yeah.
often a good cooking day. um, Luckily, I enjoy doing that. Don't love shopping, to be honest, Claire. Don't love
Oh,
going grocery shopping at the supermarket.
oh,
I
don't
love
you?
going to the market. Love going to the markets, and I love cooking. My family will tell you I get them to go to the
The
supermarket.
supermarket,
Uh,
yeah, off with the list. So, what's the recipe that you're sharing with that we're going to name after you, Kerith?
well, the one that I shared was an interesting one, Claire. It was a salt and pepper tofu.
Mm.
And the reason I thought that that might be a good one is because firm tofu is something you can do so many things with. If you're not going to the supermarket a couple of times a week, like I don't, it lasts ages in the fridge.
Yeah.
And the salt and pepper tofu, like you can do it in an egg and breadcrumb mix, or you can simply, stick it in a bag or a Tupperware with some rice flour and some seasoning and shake it up and cook it in shallow fried in some um, olive oil or rice bran oil, and then add it to a poke bowl or a stir fry, or you can, do it more Mediterranean and use it as a meat alternative in um, Mediterranean dishes or in curries, anything. It's very versatile to use. So, an easy recipe that you don't need to necessarily have gone to the supermarket to get,
Yeah.
and good for your meat free Monday
Yeah.
or whenever you want to do
Yeah.
that.
Great for vegetarians because it's tofu is soy protein. I've got to tell
Yeah.
you, Kerith, that to me that was one of the advantages of the lockdowns, we had during COVID, was getting in, having that time to cook some more interesting things. And not dissimilar from your recipe, it's Ottolingi's pepper tofu is
Hmm.
became one of my favorites. It's all green vegetables. It's really a stir fry with the tofu added. But yeah, so and I went, oh wow, I actually love tofu, and it's become a regular ever since. So thanks for that, and that'll go up on the website, your recipe as well. But
Thank you.
as we're finishing up, I really hope that people who've got gut problems or think they've got gut problems actually take the opportunity to try and get the help. So your practice, Help Yourself Dietetics, you see
Mhm.
people specifically with gut issues, and I know that there would be other dietitians who specialize in it. So we'll also put the link to how to find a dietitian, because it's got the search, doesn't it? You can search people's specialties. But
Correct. Yeah.
in your experience of working with people with gut health, do you see that people sort of get to the end of their journey when you're working with them to try and improve their gut health and go, I wish I'd known about this strategy. I wish I'd come to see you years earlier. What hope do you have? Is there hope for people who have gut problems?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And yes, definitely. I think that either we can help people find solutions to their gut symptoms. So, because we work in the sort of disorders of gut brain interaction or functional space, one thing I do is get back in touch with people if I haven't heard from them for a while, because their symptoms can resolve. And so then they don't need you anymore. And it's just lovely to get in touch with somebody who says, thank you so much for reaching out. My quality of life is so much better and I am moving forward. But also for people who continue to suffer, to understand the relationship between their symptoms and food, and often to diversify their diet without fear, because fear of eating with any gut issue becomes kind of a driver, and then that can kind of induce symptoms on its own
Yeah,
alongside the condition. So, understanding the relationship between food and symptoms and how that works is very empowering for people too, even if we don't completely resolve them, but work out strategies to best meet their needs and their health goals, and particularly their quality of life. You
yeah,
don't want people with symptoms.
yeah, and I can imagine improve their nutrition related health and well-being.
Well, exactly.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Kerith. We'll put those links in the show notes, and it's been really wonderful talking to you today about um, additives, nutrition, and gut health.
Thanks for having me, Claire. I've really enjoyed it.